Hello, everybody. Should we get going? Should we start? Right, I'm going to introduce Prince, who is a trustee of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, one of my colleagues, fellow trustees, and also vice chair at the moment. Prince is going to talk to us today on conservation and action, reviving earthen heritage at Gidan Makama in Kano. And he's an architectural and urban designer with over 10 years of experience across architecture, urbanism, and design. And he's founder of the Henry Ajene Studio Limited, and as well as being a trustee, of course, of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, and also an expert panel member for Design Southeast. He's also got experience delivering residential, cultural, urban design, and mixed use projects across the UK and West Africa, and recently served as a UK design team lead for the award-winning guest artist space Lagos, and an arts complex for the British Nigerian artist Yinka Shonabara, while working with LC Owusu Architects as well. And that's how we first met him. And he's also recently led a heritage skills training program in Kano in partnership with the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, that's ourselves, and the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, focused on traditional building techniques and conservation practice. And his work is driven by an interest in the relationship between architecture, culture, and everyday life, with a focus on environmentally and socially responsive design. So I think without saying any more, I'm going to hand over to Prince, and we'll have questions afterwards. So the talk will probably last about 40 minutes. And then if you could put any questions or anything you'd like to say in the chat, we'll then have a discussion and Prince can answer any questions afterwards. So over to you, Prince.
Thanks, Nicolette. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about Gidan Makama Museum in Kano, which is in northern Nigeria. It's one of the oldest surviving traditional buildings in West Africa. And this talk is about what we did there in January of this year, 2026, and why it matters beyond the site. So I don't know if everyone could see the second slide now. So
I don't know, just to say, some of the text seems to be cut off slightly. It's like pages of a book.
Okay, let me see if
just reduce the size.
Let me see if I can do that. I'll stop and share again. Better?
That's better, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Rachel. So the central question we asked is when the knowledge to maintain it is disappearing. I think this is being answered one building at a time across West Africa, in the Middle East, South Asia. When the craftsmen who know how to maintain traditional earthen buildings are no longer there, the buildings decay at a rate that no amount of funding can reverse. You can commission repairs, but if you cannot find anyone who knows how to carry them out correctly, you'll cause more damage than you prevent. So that is the program, and that's the problem this program sets out to address. And the core argument of this talk is conservation programs that focus only on the physical repair of buildings, but simultaneously training the people who maintain them when they're fighting a losing battle. So what we tried to do at Gidan Makama was to hold both things together at the same time, repair the building and train the people, transfer the knowledge. And this talk today, I'll try and explain, do my best to explain how and why we did that. So Kano is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in West Africa. So for over a millennium, it sat at the crossroad between the trans-Saharan trade routes, connecting North Africa, the Sahel, and the rainforest and forest regions of southern parts of the Gulf of Guinea, in particular modern-day Nigeria. So it's one of the great Hausa city-states. It developed a distinctive urban shape around commerce, Islamic scholarship, its royal institutions, and a very rich tradition of craftsmanship from their leather tanneries to ironsmithing and the fantastic earthen architecture as well. So the historic environment of the city contains a concentration of some key heritage assets. It used to have and still has maintains part of what was the ancient Kano city walls, its royal palace and mosques, and some traditional neighborhoods that's still built from earthen architecture. But many of the buildings are increasingly under risk and pressure from urbanization, from age, environmental issues, as well as changing and development patterns. The gradual, and most critically in the case of Gidan Makama, we saw that there's been a serious loss of skilled craftsmen who can maintain these local buildings. So Gidan Makama sits at the heart of the historic quarter in Kano. Immediately adjacent to it is the current Emir's Palace, which remains in active use till today. So the two buildings share a common history. Understanding one means you understand the other. So the site we worked in is shown here in red. That's the museum compound. And the historic boundary in blue, which shows the original extent of the Gidan Makama Palace before it was taken over by Lord Lugard in 1903 during the British invasion of Kano, and then split into three different uses later on. So one third of it still retains at the museum. The other third is the current Makama, which is a royal title for one of the kingmakers, still his official residence and a primary school. So photo of. So it was constructed as a residence for someone called Mohammed Rumfa in 1450. And then between 1463 to 1470, it was then used as the first Emir's Palace. As I mentioned earlier, it was repurposed in 1903 as a British administrative headquarters. And in 1953, it was then handed back as a museum. In 1985, it then became fully known as a national museum. So, the Makama title is, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the noble councillors of the Kano Emirate. And when the Department of Antiquities were formed, it later went to the NCMM, which were our partners in the training program. So the museum compound is organized in a series of galleries and interconnected courtyards arranged along this long central axis. And it's typical of Hausa palaces. And you can see that the galleries, these rooms have now been converted to galleries, and they're numbered. Here you can see Gallery 2, which is the Zaure, which is the main entrance space and how you process into traditional Hausa palaces and compounds. At the far right hand, you can see gallery 14 at the bottom. Sorry, at the bottom, I mean, which was Focus, which was the British gallery. We had surveyed quite a few of the galleries to see the existing conditions and how we may, start to look at doing some conservation work on them. So next part of I'll try to introduce the traditional Hausa Earthen architecture. It's not simply just a vernacular building in the sense of unplanned or improvised construction. It's a bit more sophisticated than that. There's a technical system which has been refined over centuries in response to the context, which is extreme heat and the aridity of the Sahelian climate. So the thick earthen walls tend to act as a thermal mass, and they're used for the thermal mass, absorbing the heat during the day and keeping inhabitants cool. The internal courtyard still promotes natural ventilation through the buildings, and using organic timber fibers that are sourced locally, and all the materials that are found locally within its context. So there's a climate responsive and resource efficient method or way of constructing that is deeply embedded into the Hausa building systems. So the raw materials of this. So these are some of the raw materials of Hausa earthen construction. The earth is the primary material, but it's not just any earth. So these things are quite carefully selected by artisans. So you have clay content and some organic stabilizers using things like locust beans and the desert gum. As using the desert gum as a binder, you can have the goat's hair as fiber reinforcement. So they are not just you can't categorize them as I wouldn't categorize them as primitive substitute for modern materials. They're in their own right, I think, products of century of material science, which I think were developed without labs but tested over time. And there's also interesting processes when constructing that they take a lot of time. So the desert gum would be soaked and allowed to ferment for days. Once the mortar mix is made, they let it sit for a couple of while, a few days, and come back mix again in order to achieve structural strength and let the materials cure adequately. So the tubali, which is the fundamental unit of Hausa masonry, which is the conical bricks. So it's a sun-dried earthen brick formed by hand, and it's a prepared mixture of the clay, laterite sand, and some organic stabilizers. The consistency of the mix and the forming technique and drying period require skills and judgment. So traditionally, this used to be done by the Saracen Guineas, which are the traditional Hausa builders, and this used to be a hereditary craft which was passed from father to son. And that has also led to sort of the scarcity of manpower we face nowadays, because the younger generation are interested in other things. And with Gidan Makama, we were able to get some of those families that were happy to share those techniques and knowledge beyond the family unit to all interested parties. So you can see that some of the photographs you're seeing are historical images from about, we suspect, between 1953, when the building was handed over, to 1955 and restored. And they show the practice of using the making of the tubali, as well as the laying of the timber structural roof members, which are Azara desert palms. So the Azara desert palm timbers are used throughout traditional Hausa construction. They're used as for structural reinforcement within the walls. They provide horizontal restraint and limit cracking and allow them to form the corbels and beams to make domed roofs. In the roofs, they span radially outward from the center point, and they create they have the characteristics of a shallow dome or a cone that you see in most of the traditional house of buildings. So an earthen topping is usually applied and then finished with traditional plaster. So understanding the roof logic is quite essential. And this was really essential for the works we undertook on Gallery 11. So traditional house architecture also has a sophisticated system of surface finishing. And the three primary plaster systems that exist are the Makuba, Lasso, and Shafe. So each perform different roles. Makuba provides the base protection coat. Lasso also stabilizes the intermediate layer. And the Shafe is usually the final coat and the coat that is used for elaborate reliefs and finishes. They can be worked into some interesting ornamental patterns, but all carry cultural and symbolic meaning. And these relief geometrical forms in themselves encode years of messages and being passed down to and semiotics. So it's an intangible, so it's a very tangible a way of passing down and recording. So next slide. So when we carried out initial conditional survey at Gidan Makama, we found that there was plaster loss in the underlying earthen fabric. There was cracking throughout walls, deterioration at vulnerable junctions, at doorways, window reveals. The building's protective skin was failing in quite a few places, and once the base surfaces were exposed to heavy rainfalls over time, weathered and accelerated deterioration. And in some cases, in most cases, we're working against the clock. So the most urgent problem we faced was Gallery 11. The gallery had suffered a significant roof collapse. And when the traditional roof fails, it doesn't just leave a gap. It starts to expose the walls to direct rainfall. There's accelerating erosion, and there's a risk of structural instability. The surviving historic fabric of the gallery was at risk, as you can see in the images, and we had to intervene urgently, and it couldn't just simply be handed over to a contractor. So we had to come up with a method that, of getting the people who understood how the building was constructed, what the compatible materials are, and how to build it, and get it back to its original state. So it's important to understand the problems that the faced at Gidan Makama. At a site like this, I think probably not just unique to Gidan Makama, but probably across the Commonwealth. It can be three linked problem. The first thing is physical deterioration, and the fabric fails at the rate of failure is accelerating, and then you have a bigger problem of when you have incompatible modern repairs, which may be well intentioned, but and in our case, there was well-intentioned cement-based renders and patches that were just not compatible with earthen construction. And the third and most important point, and which we tried to address here, was the loss of knowledge. The pool of craftspeople who understand to carry out this repair was shrinking. And if we addressed only the first problem, you may actually worsen the second and the third. So I think conservation has to work across these three levels at once. And to my next slide. So in several areas of Gidan Makama, we found evidence of previous repairs that were carried out using cement-based plaster. So I think it's a very seems to be a very common problem across earthen heritage sites. The cement renders were dense and impermeable, and when you apply these things to traditional earthen walls, they prevent the natural breathability, and moisture isn't expelled, and the moisture that enters through cracks or at, let's say, the base don't escape, and it then causes the earthen fabric behind the render to start to disintegrate while still having the render intact, and without people realizing until it's too late. So although well-intentioned, the outcome is often the opposite, and the conservation approach we took was to therefore prioritize traditional breathable and compatible materials throughout. So Gallery 11 was the urgent focus of conservation works. The gallery sits within the core of the compound, and its roof had suffered significant collapse. I think from the aerial images here, you can see the extent of the damage. You can see how the gallery was open to the sky, and you can see some of the Azara timber members and the traditional matting that was used to construct the original roof. The building had scattered across, and you have every rainfall event was, threatens to expand the damage. So the question was, how do we then intervene correctly, and how do we use this intervention as a teachable moment? And in this case, we were fortunate to start the works during the dry season. In terms of climate, Nigeria has two major seasons, the wet and the dry. And the dry season runs from sometime between September up until April. And that gave us the opportunity to intervene ahead of the rainy season. Because of the scale of the damage and the time it takes to actually rebuild the walls, this wasn't able to be fully done during the 2-week training program. So we had to start the works ahead and then record the process, some of those processes for the trainees. So I think the next part presentation I'll try and talk about is the program we ran for 2 weeks in January at Gidan Makama. We had 30 participants, 2 weeks on this, it was site-based, and there was no simulations, no, the museum became our classroom, and the training, then had a lot of real on-site learning with using experienced craftspeople. And the program was commissioned by the CHF and funded through the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Commonwealth Heritage Skill Training Program. And we had the support of the National Commissions for Museum and Monuments, the management of the Gidan Makama Museum, as well as the architecture department of the Bayero University in Kano. And we're able to coordinate and ensure that there was an academic expertise and in recruitment within the training delivery. I think it was cute. I think that was a crucial part to marry up the academics with the traditional artisans to sort of support the sort of conservation modules and training that's been given to the architecture students as well. So the participants were selected through a collaborative process, and we had a deliberate mix of architecture students and local artisans. And the architecture students came from the Bayero University, and we also had locals, young persons who were identified through the Emirates, and the community. And we had the community chiefs, the district heads, as well as traditional artisans as trainers, and as well as some professors from the university. So the first week was structured around understanding and introducing how the practice of Earthen Hausa architecture and setting up a theoretical base. So before the participants carried out any repairs, they needed to understand what they were repairing and why. And the sessions we had covered history of Earthen architecture, traditional building materials, construction methods, indigenous conservation practices, and the cultural and decorative traditions of the house architecture. On day 3, I think on the third day of the training, we adjusted the time to visit the Emir's Palace, which was down the road. And it's one of the finest surviving examples of Hausa palaces and architecture. And it's a living institution that sort of gave a very powerful context and insight for the trainees. And on week 2, we shifted from theory to making. So the participants worked directly with traditional materials under the guidance of our master artisans, and they went from mixing earth, then forming the Tibali bricks. They prepared plaster mixes, practice how to layer the makuba, and do some shafe. They also contributed to documentation and live conservation works. On the 8th day, we then took the trainees on another field visit to the Kano city walls and to the Panisal Palace, which was examining large-scale earthen defensive infrastructure and understanding the relationship between the palaces and the defensive sort of structure. And by the end of the 2 weeks, every participant had handled the materials, they had worked on earth, and they not only understood the processes of working and building up traditional house architecture, but they understood the principles and the theory as to why it's important for us to conserve our heritage. So I've split my presentation into two sections. So I will share another section now. So slides. Right. So one of the most important decision of the program was to locate the training entirely at the museum, and rather than having a dedicated lecture hall. And with the, it was a really good space for the trainees to engage with the historic fabric, see what, the causes of the ongoing deterioration firsthand, and learn from the skilled artisans who were given urgent conservation. So they were in contact with real problems and real materials. So before they could make bricks or form any plaster, participants were learned about things like the soil selection, which is, I think, a particular skill that can't be taught taught in a lecture hall. You had the master artisans take the trainees to sites where they can source the earth, and you need to check its plasticity, and that's how I understood it. Assess the clay content and assess and understand how it would behave when wet and how dry. So the traditional craftsmen were amazing, and they did help us to. It was a part of the program that I quite enjoyed, and that passing of that embodied knowledge to a new generation. So participants were able to then learn the ratio of clay to sand, the quantity and type of stabilizers used, and consistency of the mix, and the particular where at what point do you mix these things with hands, at what point do you use your feet when mixing the mortar. They produced bricks, and they were set to dry in the sun. They returned to assess the results. Some worked well. I think others were of qualities that can be improved, and that then gave more insights. So we were fortunate to have some surviving descendants of the traditional builders. You can see on the left, interestingly, the Sarakin Guinea, who was the master builder, ended up, once we pulled the photos from the archive, was able to identify his father, who had previously restored the building in the 1950s. And I think I also want to emphasize the role of the traditional artisans. They were the primary technical experts, and the master builders held knowledge that you couldn't get from the university curriculum. And I think both the university lecturers, myself included, we learned a lot from the traditional artisans. So just a bit more detail about the field visits. You can see the photos here show the visit to the current Emir's palace, and I think they accounted one of the most interesting ceremonial buildings, and it was able to give a contrast with with what the level at which the finishes and things like the shafi and decorative mixes or reliefs on the patterns on the walls from Gidan Makama to the palace. So yes, we've spoken about the reinstatement of the roof. So we had also tried to emphasize the importance of carrying out condition surveys to the trainees to understand what defects are and where that sort of professional underpinning and knowledge from um, students who probably go on to become architects or conservation specialists, ideally conservation architects, to feed in and then know how to specify and advise and plan restoration projects in the future. The repair principles we had set was clear. So we had assessed what was remaining of the original roof structure and what could be reused, and the load capacity, bearing capacity of the walls, what were the original materials and how can we source them, and the materials available, how compatible would they be with the historic buildings, and more importantly, what should be reconstructed. So we had used only traditionally and locally sourced and breathable materials. We matched the construction sequence of the original building. We have tried to our best to avoid introducing any kind of modern materials that wouldn't be compatible with the Earthen structure. And most importantly, we documented every stage for future reference. We had a time lapse and different recordings of all this, which was then deposited at the museum and the university's library. So just on the Earthen construction, it requires, I had mentioned earlier that it required extended curing and drying periods between each stage. So in the restoration of Gallery 11, we had the walls built in sections and allowed to cure and dry before it was before they could continue. So we had to pre-program those works before the training. So we had to take health and safety quite seriously, and we had to avoid trainees working at height because it's the first time interacting with the materials. We then left those parts to be things that could be taught afterwards in class through videos. So before I discuss about the impact and the lessons we learned, it's worth noting that the challenges were not unique to Kano, and I think approximately 15% of UNESCO World Heritage Sites include significant ethnic architecture. And communities are facing these sort of physical deterioration, material incompatibility, and knowledge loss. And I think the response is skills training integrated with live conservation works. It just recognizes that the most effective, and I think it's probably the most effective model in retaining knowledge systems, which I think all of these sort of architecture depends on. And this is what we achieved at Gidan Makama. And in terms of impact, I think the first and most direct impact was the skills development for majority of the participants, and it was their first opportunity to handle traditional earthen materials. And the program provided something that I think in particular, the architecture students hadn't really encountered in a formal education. And they that first-hand experience and connections between the architecture students and the artisans was quite important. So we had a closing ceremony, and that included presentations by participant groups who had undertaken various assignments to sort of assess their learnings, and they were able to present their findings to an audience of parents, well-wishers, and people from the local arts and culture community. And they had presented their findings on the condition assessment, on things like material identification, and for different areas of house architecture, things about the geometries, and I think that really gave us evidence of 2 weeks of real learning and quality engagement. So beyond the individual learning outcomes, I think, yeah. So beyond the individual learning outcomes, I think, there's a strengthened partnership between the collaboration between the NCMM and the university, and they functioned effectively throughout. The program also increased the profile of Gidan Makama with media coverage, and in particular the importance of skills training and conservation. So I would say that one of the 4 lessons was conservation must follow material behavior. Traditional artisans are technical experts, and training is the strongest link we can do when we attach it to live conservation work. And the earthen architecture requires long-term maintenance. I don't think one-off interventions would be enough. Right. So, yeah, I would like to use this opportunity to thank the CHF, the NCMM, the BUK, the traditional artisans for their support, and thank you all for coming to this talk and listening to me.
Thank you, Prince. It was a pleasure listening to you. It's fascinating. I mean, this loss of traditional building skills is something that has been repeating in all these talks in this series, interestingly. And the replacement with modern incompatible building materials and the loss of artisan skills are all things that just keep on recurring. And yet they're so important, and conserving heritage in all these different places is so important, and the role of artisans is so important. And I think this is something that over the years the skills have disappeared, partly because it was seen as perhaps lower status. It was, I don't know, there are a number of reasons, presumably, and yet trying to re-engender that interest and the importance of them is so important. And I think that's what these projects are beginning to do, which is really heartening, and trying to actually say, no, these skills are so important. They're really an integral part of preserving people's heritage, and also the sustainable aspect of traditional building skills. This is gained over millennia, isn't it? And those skills, the way buildings are built nowadays more than ever in our years of climate change and sustainable construction, this is really a very, very relevant topic at the moment. And also their use in modern design, which I think is really interesting too. These skills, not only are they relevant to buildings like this, and these are historical buildings, of course, but new buildings as well. And I think that's beginning to be recognized, isn't it? Gradually. Takes time, but it is beginning to. There were some comments in the chat which Peregrine Bryant, who's one of our fellow trustees, has said that you described the incorporation of timber binders to help give stability and reduce movement. And he says timber binders of one sort or another have been used everywhere. The problem is that they are generally susceptible to rot and infestation, presumably also a progressive problem here. So I don't know whether you could perhaps say a bit about that, if it is a problem.
Here, no, because of the sort of timber they use. So the Azara is a dry desert palm, and it's sort of an anti-termites, so termites can't eat them, and they actually, it was one of our health and safety issues. They're quite dangerous to handle, because once you get pricked by the fibers, it takes a long time to heal. So which was something I found quite interesting about the traditional Hausa architecture, and that's what allowed most of the structures and buildings to survive. So when they do fail, it's mostly from the it's never really the timbers. It has to do with the earth and the mix deteriorating over time.
Interesting. And that's, of course, experience gains over generations, as you say, from one generation to the next. And then that's broken and lost, and you have to relearn those techniques. And it was incredibly practical. They'd use all these local materials that were available locally, and they all had these properties, and they obviously knew just how to avoid some of these problems. Somebody else said, what about termites? In Egypt and Yemen, we found that they work as armies to attack mud, brick, and rammed earth, and especially where there were organic additives. So presumably this is what you were saying. They've developed a way of avoiding it.
Yeah, so in Gidan Makama, we didn't find any problems with termites. Most of the problems was with water ingress, and in particular where the most of the building had been wrongly plastered at some 10 years, 15 years ago. So I think they had hired a contractor who had thought like it's best to plaster the whole museum and paint it.
The very worst thing that could possibly be done.
Yeah, and Nicolette, there was something you picked up about these techniques not only being used for historic buildings but also modern construction. I can't speak to it, but I know some of the feedback we got from the architecture students is that the techniques they learned from here and the insight is what they would like to use it for their thesis and new projects, and use the earth in new ways, and which I found quite interesting, because I think some of those vernaculars are stuck in the time, and there's not been enough research to sort of bring them forward, and these techniques, how they might inform the architecture we practice today, or the buildings we create for today and for tomorrow.
Yeah, because it's that knowledge, isn't it? The knowledge of those materials, and then being able to take that forward, as you say, in new ways. And that is so important, because those are the materials that work best in places that have been tried and tested over many years. And you lose that knowledge, and modern building materials are not necessarily the most suitable for climate and the particular conditions. So I think that's really important. Richard Hughes has said, just to note, that ICOMOS is finalizing a new international charter on the conservation of earthen architecture. If and when adopted, I think it will be available this August. So that sounds like a very interesting document to note. And I think that connection to to ICOMOS is really important, and something that I think the CHF could definitely build on. And then another message says, I'm honored to have participated in a training which helped contribute to the development of this charter, and together with another address here, which it will be in the chat if anybody wants to take it. So I think, it's obviously very widely appreciated, and it can only be a positive thing. And somebody else has said, I'm curious about the geometric patterns. Are there specific meanings? Well, I think you mentioned that there were.
Yes, there were. They had different geometric patterns for the exterior of buildings and the ones they use internally. I think a better example of that was within the current Emir's Palace. And when we went on field visits, there were some rooms that told the story. And there was particularly one of the throne rooms, which told the story of the first plane to land in Nigeria, happened to be in Kano. So it is a way of, so geometric patterns have different meanings, and there are different patterns for that you do not use. There's some patterns you do not use on the exterior, you do not use them on the interior.
Fascinating, and most people don't actually know about this. I mean, it's an abstract way of having a mural, I suppose, isn't it? That you might find in another country. But I mean, it's a fascinating. So not only is it practical, but it's symbolic as well. So, and those skills to do those patterns really must take quite some knowledge, and to be able to pass that down. And what you said about some of those old photographs, people recognize their parents and things. That's amazing that there was that. What an incredible way to find out. Somebody else, Edith, David said, what plan have the academic about sustainability of the building skills that are not being passed on? So I'm not quite sure whether that's one you can answer. I think that probably means, yes, what plan of the academics, that's probably the universities, about sustainability of building skills that are not being passed on at the moment. And I think that's exactly what this is for.
Yeah, I think that's what this is for. And I think it's I think the training kind of helped because it was recorded. And those recordings are things that I think one way of storing the knowledge, as so that which can inform probably future research.
So it's recording it so that you've got it there for the future, and using the latest digital techniques, and I suppose to be able to do that instead of handing it down from father to son and orally. Somebody else, it's Richard Hughes, says, commonly we find that traditional builders understand something about soil plasticity, Atterberg limits and dry density, moisture content relationships, but do not understand the role of manipulating soil for pore suctions. This is really technical, and for increasing density, compressive strength. So that's there again, these are skills presumably gained generation after generation, and that people just know this stuff, which of course is the stuff that's being lost. And I think that's exactly what and the Commonwealth Heritage Forum is trying to perhaps reverse. I don't know whether there's anything else you want to say about that.
I think that's something for the academics. I think that's something for the academics to sort of investigate and see how where are the gaps. There's probably opportunities for some research projects.
A thesis or two in there, isn't there?
Thesis or two in there. Yes.
And somebody else has said, thanks for an inspiring talk. How long is it projected that these materials will remain before needing repair? This is all the more important to keep and develop the skills for working with such materials. I was wondering about that too, because I think you were mentioning, obviously, that this sort of building technique requires constant maintenance, because that's what you did probably always. You patched it up and you put a bit more local material on it and kept it going. But that we don't tend to do that anymore. So it would be interesting to know from you what those plans are.
Yes. So historically, when they applied the Makuba plaster on the exterior, during the dry seasons, it's so that's once every year. Though there is a waterproofing, what they call the katsi, which is some residue they get from the dye pits, and they mix it up, and they, almost like you give it a lick of paint again.
Running repairs,
and that way the buildings don't have issues. But the problem was, as the knowledge became scarce. You get less and less people that are able to do these things. People leave the buildings, and after maybe 2, 3, 4 raining seasons, they start to deteriorate, which I think was what informed the contractor who had gone in to use, cement plaster, and said, with this, you don't have to be doing the annual maintenance. And yeah, what then ended up was that the buildings, after some years, had been having water damage behind the skin, and
yeah, it couldn't be more wrong, could it? Because
Yeah.
they're not breathable, presumably,
Yeah.
and they can't cope with the climate. And that's a problem in many different countries. Mohammed says, can you elaborate on the compressive strength of dried mud bricks and rammed earth? Please discuss the typical compressive strength values, the factors influencing their strength, and how the structural performance compares under similar conditions. Richard Hughes said he can give him some figures about that. But obviously the compressive strength of dried mud brick and rammed earth.
I don't think I don't know about the comparison, but what I'd say is that in this case, their dried mud bricks gains strength from them being conical, and the shape sort of helps interlock the strength. But I think that's probably the more technical question than I can answer.
Well, that sounds like Richard Hughes has the answer, and he's an Arab, so I think he might be able to help out there. Yes. It's fascinating. I mean, you think a brick is a brick, but of course that's not the case at all. And as you say, it's the shape that gives it the strength and how they all interlock.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a subject one could talk about for hours, and I think we've covered the questions in the chat now, and obviously there is this guidance that's possibly coming out in the future, which would be good to know about when it does. And I think this leads us very neatly onto the fact that we're trying to organize our next series, which will cover sustainable architecture and building, and how different countries are coping with climate change. So watch this space on our website. And thank you, Prince. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think, this is a subject that we will definitely want to discuss more of in a future series. So many thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.